I was seething when Gail finally walked through the door, 3 hours late and reeking of cheap perfume. My hands were shaking as I tried to keep my cool, but inside, I was a volcano ready to blow. "Where the hell have you been?" I growled, my voice low and dangerous. Gail barely glanced at me as she kicked off her shoes. "Working, Mac." "What's it look like?" "Working? For 3 extra hours? Without so much as a phone call?" She shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Boss asked if I could stay late. Pays cash. Figured you'd appreciate the extra money." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But something in her eyes, the way she wouldn't quite meet my gaze, set off alarm bells in my head. What kind of work pays cash at? I checked my watch, 2 in the morning. Gail's eyes flashed. "The kind that puts food on our table, Mac." "You got a problem with that?" I did have a problem with that, a big one. But I had to leave for my own shift in 10 minutes, and I knew this wasn't a conversation we could finish that quick. "We'll talk about this later," I said, grabbing my keys. The slam of the door behind me didn't do much to ease the knot in my gut. As I drove to work, my mind wandered back to how we'd ended up here. It was '83, and the recession had hit us hard. I'd been laid off from my factory job, and Gail had never been much for working. We were scraping by on unemployment and whatever odd jobs I could pick up. It wasn't pretty, but we were managing. Then Bobby, an old buddy from high school, threw me a lifeline. "Got some construction work," he'd said over beers one night. "Under the table, if you want it. Won't mess with your benefits." I jumped at the chance. It wasn't much, but it was something. I remember rushing home that night, eager to share the good news with Gail. But when I burst through the door, grinning like an idiot, Gail was in one of her moods. She took one look at me and her eyes narrowed. "You reek of beer," she spat. "Out drinking while I'm home worrying about how we're gonna pay the bills?" I tried to explain about Bobby and the job, but Gail wasn't having it. She was off on one of her tears, and I knew from experience there was no stopping her once she got going. "Maybe if you'd finished high school, you could find a real job," I snapped back, immediately regretting the words. Gail's face went white, then red. "Oh, that's rich coming from you. Mr. Big Shot with his diploma. Fat lot of good it's doing us now, huh?" We went back and forth like that for a while, rehashing old arguments and picking at old wounds. By the time we'd worn ourselves out, any excitement I'd had about the new job had long since faded. That night, lying in bed with Gail's back turned to me, I couldn't help but wonder how we'd gotten here. We used to be happy, didn't we? Or was that just another thing the recession had taken from us? I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, my alarm was blaring and it was time to head to the job site. Gail was already gone, probably to avoid another fight. As I worked alongside Bobby that day, hauling lumber and sweating under the summer sun, I tried to push thoughts of Gail and our problems out of my mind. But they kept creeping back in, like water finding cracks in a dam. "You all right, man?" Bobby asked during our lunch break. "You seem a million miles away." I shrugged, taking a long pull from my water bottle. "Just, life." Bobby nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Yeah, I hear that. Times are tough all over." I appreciated Bobby's sympathy, but I wasn't ready to spill my guts. Instead, I changed the subject, asking about the job and how long he thought it might last. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. I'd work with Bobby during the day, come home bone-tired, and Gail and I would dance around each other like wary cats. We were talking, but not really communicating. Then one day, Gail burst through the door while I was fixing dinner, her face lit up like a Christmas tree. Mac, you won't believe it," she exclaimed, practically bouncing on her toes. I turned from the stove, eyebrow raised. "What's got you so fired up?" "I got a job." She beamed, throwing her arms around me. For a moment, I forgot all about our recent tensions. I hugged her back, grinning. "That's great, honey. Where at?" Her smile faltered a bit. It's at the Starlight Motel. Night shift." My own smile froze. The Starlight wasn't exactly known for its upstanding clientele. The Starlight? "Gail, is that safe?" She waved off my concern. "Oh, don't be such a worrywart. It's just desk work. Check people in, handle the phones. Easy peasy." I wasn't convinced. But at night? In that neighborhood? Gail's eyes hardened a bit. "Honey, no one, and I mean no one, comes to the desk after midnight. It'll be fine." I wanted to argue more, but the determined set of her jaw told me it would be useless. Besides, we needed the money. So I swallowed my doubts and tried to be supportive. "Well, congratulations, then," I said, forcing a smile. "When do you start?" "Tomorrow night," she replied, her excitement returning. "Oh, Mac, this is going to change everything for us. You'll see." As I watched her practically float out of the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change, all right. I just wasn't sure it would be for the better. The first few weeks of Gail's new job seemed to go okay. Money was a little easier, and the constant tension in our house eased up some. But I started noticing changes in Gail. It was little things at first. New clothes, fancier makeup. She started going to the salon more often, getting her nails done. When I asked about it, she'd just smile and say, "A girl's gotta look her best, right?" But it was more than that. There was a new confidence in her walk, a glint in her eye that I'd never seen before. It both attracted and unnerved me. One night, as we lay in bed, I decided to broach the subject. "So, how's the job going?" "Really?" Gail turned to me, a mysterious smile playing on her lips. "It's interesting. I've never talked to you about it, but there's a lot to see at the motel." "What does that mean?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. She just shrugged and rolled over. "Nothing, honey. Go to sleep." But I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, imagining all sorts of scenarios. What exactly was Gail seeing at that motel? And why didn't she want to talk about it? The next morning, as Gail was getting ready to head out for some errands, I noticed her fumbling with her purse. A wad of cash fell out, way more than she should have had from her motel salary. My heart nearly stopped when I saw that cash. I picked it up, trying to keep my voice steady. "Gail, where did this come from?" She snatched it back, stuffing it into her purse. "Tips, Mac. You'd be surprised how generous some folks can be." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But the nagging doubt in my gut wouldn't let up. "That's an awful lot of tips for a night clerk." Gail's eyes flashed dangerously. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," I said, backing off. "I'm just surprised, is all." She huffed, grabbing her keys. "Well, don't be. I told you this job would change things for us. Maybe you should just be grateful." The door slammed behind her, leaving me standing there, feeling like a fool. Grateful? Yeah, right. More like suspicious as hell. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, Gail's words echoing in my head. By the time my alarm went off, I'd made up my mind. I was going to find out what was really going on at that motel. I called Bobby, told him I needed the night off. He didn't ask questions, just said, "You got it, man." "Everything okay?" "I hope so," I muttered, not believing it for a second. I waited until Gail left for her shift, then hopped in my truck and headed to the Starlight. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel as I pulled into a spot across the street, out of sight of the motel office. For the first hour, nothing happened. I was starting to feel like an idiot, sitting there spying on my own wife. But then I saw her. Gail came out of the office, looked around furtively, then hurried down the street. I slouched down in my seat as she passed, my heart pounding. She wasn't heading home. No, she was walking towards the Kitty Cat Club, a seedy strip joint a couple blocks down. What the hell? I watched, dumbfounded, as she disappeared inside. 10 minutes later, she came back out and returned to the motel. This pattern repeated several times throughout the night. I felt sick. What was Gail doing at a strip club? Was she? No, I couldn't even think it. But the evidence was right in front of me. Around 3 a.m., I saw Bobby's truck pull into the motel parking lot. What was he doing here? I watched as he got out and headed straight for the office. My mind was reeling. Bobby and Gail? No, it couldn't be. Bobby was my friend. He wouldn't. But then again, I thought I knew my wife, too. I was about to get out of the truck and confront them when Bobby came back out. He looked around, spotted my truck, and walked over. I rolled down the window, my mouth dry. Bobby? What are you doing here? He leaned in, his face grim. I could ask you the same thing, Mac. But I think we both know why we're here. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Bobby sighed. She's a dancer, Mac. Her stage name is Desiree, and she's pretty good at it. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I gripped the steering wheel to steady myself. A dancer? You mean? Yeah, Bobby said softly. I'm sorry, man. I saw her in there last week when I was meeting a buddy. Didn't know how to tell you. I felt like I was going to be sick. Does everyone know? Am I the last to find out? Bobby shook his head. I don't think so. Look, Mac, what are you gonna do? I sat there for a long moment, trying to process everything. My wife was stripping at some sleazy club. And who knows what else she might be doing for money. I don't know, Bobby, I finally said. I honestly don't know. Bobby clapped a hand on my shoulder. Whatever you decide, I've got your back, man. You need anything, you just say the word. I nodded, grateful for his support. Thanks. I think I need to go home and think. The drive back was a blur. My mind was racing, replaying every conversation, every fight, every suspicious moment from the past few months. I didn't confront Gail when she got home that morning. I couldn't face her, couldn't bear to hear whatever lies or excuses she might come up with. Instead, I pretended to be asleep, listening as she moved around the house. For the next few days, I went through the motions of our life together, all the while feeling like I was living with a stranger. Gail must have sensed something was off, but she didn't push it. Maybe she was afraid of what I might know. I knew I had to do something, but I was paralyzed. Part of me wanted to grab Chad and just run, leave all this mess behind. Another part wanted to confront Gail, to scream and rage and demand answers. But the rational part of my brain knew I needed more information before I made any moves. That's how I found myself sitting across from a state investigator, spilling my guts about everything I'd seen and suspected. The guy listened patiently, taking notes and nodding. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, fixing me with a sympathetic look. We've had our eye on that motel and the club for a while now. Suspected prostitution ring. Your information could be very helpful. I felt a mix of relief and dread. So what happens now? The investigator's face turned serious. Now, we investigate. Build our case. And that's the end of your involvement. I'm sorry, kid. It's clear you loved her. I nodded, feeling numb. Yeah, I did. I do. I don't know who she is anymore. As I left the office, I felt like I was walking in a fog. My world had been turned upside down, and I had no idea how to right it. The next month was hell. I went through the motions at work, barely able to focus. At home, the tension between Gail and me was thick enough to cut with a knife. She knew something was wrong, but she never asked. Maybe she was afraid of the answer. Then came the night of the raid. I was home with Chad when the phone rang. It was Bobby. "Mac, turn on the news," he said, his voice urgent. "They're raiding the Starlight and the kitty cat right now." I flipped on the TV, and there it was. Flashing lights, cops everywhere. And there, being led out in handcuffs, was Gail. Chad looked up at me, confusion in his eyes. "Dad? Is that Mom?" I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. How do you explain something like this to a kid? "Son, your mother. She got involved with some bad people and did some bad things. Now she doesn't want to live with us, so we are on our own." It was a lie, of course. I had no idea if Gail wanted to live with us or not. But in that moment, it was the best I could do to protect my boy from the harsh reality of what was happening. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of police interviews, lawyer meetings, and sleepless nights. I filed for divorce almost immediately, determined to get full custody of Chad. Gail didn't make it easy. Our first meeting with the lawyers was tense, to say the least. Gail walked in like she owned the place, all false bravado and defiance. But I could see the fear in her eyes. "You don't have to do this, Mac," she said, her voice low. "We can work it out." I shook my head, my jaw clenched. "There's nothing to work out, Gail. It's over." Her eyes flashed. "You can't take my son away from me." That's when I lost it. "Your son? The one you abandon every night to go dance for strangers? The one you put at risk with your activities?" Gail flinched like I'd slapped her. "Good." I leaned in close, my voice barely above a whisper. "If you fight this, Gail, a lot of dirty secrets will come out that you don't think I know about. By the time I'm done, any judge in his right mind will give me a restraining order preventing you from seeing your son." I saw the fight drain out of her. She knew I had her cornered. "What do you want?" she asked, defeated. "Full custody," I said firmly. "You get supervised visits when I say it's okay. And you stay the hell away from us otherwise." She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The divorce proceedings were mercifully quick after that. Gail didn't contest anything, probably hoping to avoid a messy trial that would air all her dirty laundry. Within a few months, it was all over. I had Chad and Gail. Well, Gail had her freedom, for what it was worth. Life went on. Chad and I settled into a new routine, just the two of us. It wasn't easy, being a single dad, but we made it work. I threw myself into my job, determined to give Chad the stable life he deserved. Years passed. Chad grew from a confused little boy into a strong, confident young man. I started dating again, eventually remarrying a wonderful woman named Katie. She was everything Gail wasn't: steady, honest, loving. Then, out of the blue, Chad dropped a bombshell on us. He was 24, fresh out of college, when he announced he wanted to marry his girlfriend, Pam. "That's great news, son," I said, genuinely happy for him. "When do we get to meet her?" Chad shifted uncomfortably. "Well, that's the thing, Dad. You kind of already know her family." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh. How's that?" He took a deep breath. "Pam's mom. Her name is Honey. She used to work with Mom. At the club." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Honey. I remembered her from the police reports, one of the women arrested alongside Gail. And now her daughter was marrying my son. "Does Pam know?" I asked, my voice tight. About what happened?" Chad nodded. "Yeah, she does. We've talked about it a lot, actually. She's not her mom, Dad. Just like I'm not mine." I sat there for a long moment, processing. Then I looked at my son, really looked at him. He wasn't that confused little boy anymore. He was a man, making his own choices. "All right," I said finally. "When's the engagement dinner?" The dinner was interesting, to say the least. Honey was there, looking older but still recognizable from the mugshots I'd seen years ago. She seemed genuinely happy for Pam and Chad, and I had to admit, Pam was a sweet girl. As we sat there, making awkward small talk and trying to ignore the elephant in the room, I couldn't help but wonder, where was Gail? Did she know about this? Would she be at the wedding? The wedding day arrived faster than I expected. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie for the 100th time, when Katie walked in. "You look handsome," she said, smoothing down my lapels. "How are you holding up?" I sighed, meeting her eyes in the reflection. "Honestly? I don't know. I'm happy for Chad, I really am. But you're worried about seeing Gail," Katie finished for me. I nodded. We'd gotten word that Gail would be attending the ceremony, keeping a low profile. It would be the first time I'd seen her in years. "Whatever happens," Katie said, squeezing my hand, "I'm right here with you." The ceremony was beautiful. Chad looked so grown up in his tuxedo, and Pam was radiant in her white dress. As I watched them exchange vows, I felt a swell of pride mixed with a twinge of sadness. My little boy was all grown up, starting a family of his own. It wasn't until the reception that I finally saw her. Gail. She was standing off to the side, nursing a glass of champagne, looking older. Tired. Her eyes met mine across the room, and for a moment, it was like no time had passed at all. I excused myself from the conversation I was half listening to and made my way over to her. Up close, I could see the years etched on her face, the weight of regret in her eyes. "Hello, Mac," she said softly. It's good to see you." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. We stood there in awkward silence for a moment before Gail spoke again. "Chad looks so handsome. You've done a great job with him." "Thanks," I managed. "He's a good kid. Man, I mean. He's a good man." Gail nodded, her eyes misty. "I know I have no right to ask, but do you think we could talk? Privately? There are things I need to say." Part of me wanted to refuse, to walk away and leave the past in the past. But another part, a part one thought I'd buried long ago, was curious. After all these years, what could Gail possibly have to say? "All right," I said finally. "But make it quick. I don't want to miss too much of the reception." We found a quiet corner of the garden outside the reception hall. Gail sat on a bench, and I leaned against a tree, keeping my distance. "I owe you an explanation," Gail began, her voice shaky. "I know it's years too late, but I need you to understand why I did what I did." I crossed my arms, steeling myself. "All right. I'm listening." Gail took a deep breath. "I did it for the money, Mac. We'd been living broke and struggling all our lives. All of a sudden I had a chance to make real money. At first, it was just dancing. But then, she trailed off, and I felt a mix of anger and pity rise in my chest. Then what, Gail? What happened? Then I got greedy, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The money was good, and I liked the attention. The power. I told myself it was all for us, for Chad, but that was a lie. I did it for me. I listened as she poured out her story. How she'd been coerced at first, but then continued willingly. How the money and the lifestyle had become addictive. How she'd lost sight of what really mattered. I was victimized by greed and stupidity, she said finally, meeting my eyes. And it cost me everything. It took me years to come to terms with it, but I've moved on. I own a gentleman's club now. Legit business, no funny stuff." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, holding it out to me. I took it reflexively, not sure what to say. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mac," Gail said, standing up. "I know I don't deserve it. I needed you to know the truth. All of it." I nodded, still processing everything she'd said. Thank you for telling me, I managed. Gail gave me a sad smile. Goodbye, Mac. I highly doubt I'll ever see you again, so live well. Love your wife and daughter and protect them as well as you can. As I watched her walk away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The anger and hurt I'd carried for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of, not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. I made my way back to the reception, finding Katie on the dance floor with our daughter, Melody. As I watched them twirl and laugh, I felt a surge of love and gratitude. Everything okay? Katie asked as I joined them. I nodded, pulling her close. Yeah, it is. Later that night, as Katie and I got ready for bed, I told her about my conversation with Gail. How do you feel about it all? She asked, her voice gentle. I thought for a moment. Honestly, I feel free. Like I can finally let go of all that anger and hurt. It doesn't change what happened, but I don't know. It helps. Katie smiled, squeezing my hand. I'm glad, Mac. You deserve peace. Just then, Melody burst into our room, her eyes bright with excitement. Mom! Dad! I have news. We turned to her, eyebrows raised. What is it, sweetie? I asked. She grinned, holding up her left hand to reveal a sparkling ring. Jake proposed. We're getting married. As Katie squealed and hugged Melody, I couldn't help but laugh. Here we go again, I thought. Another wedding. Another chance to make new memories, to build on the family we'd created. Life, I realized, had a funny way of coming full circle. But this time, I was ready for whatever came next. If you're over 18, don't miss the upcoming story and remember to click the like button to show your support. Thank you.